Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Program Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I would like to welcome you to this author series and World Affairs Today program. In tonight's event, we turn to the security threats the United States faces in the 21st century. Since the birth of the Westphalian nation-state system in the 1600s, states have been the primary actors in the wars and conflicts. Governments funded foreign ministries and militaries to make and wage war and peace. Ambassadors were the messengers and negotiators. Generals stood behind them to reinforce these policies and defend the security of the states. At an international level, this constituted much of what we understand to be foreign policy and security. State-on-state conflict was the primary concern. However, beginning in the late 20th century, non-state actors began to emerge on the international stage, from colonized populations demanding their independence, to disenfranchised and aggrieved populations seeking rights and protections, to international terrorist groups. New types of conflict have emerged. The percentage of state-on-state conflict overall has decreased, yet we continue to depend on those tools to ensure our security, with mixed results. Is there another set of foreign policy tools we can use to ensure our security? Daniel Serwer, author of Writing the Balance, How You Can Help America, stresses that civilians should become more actively involved in bringing about peace, rather than the military. Everyone from diplomats to humanitarians, judges and entrepreneurs have a role to play. Daniel is a senior research professor in conflict management at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a scholar at the Middle East Institute. In addition to his academia work, Daniel has extensive experience in the field as a State Department official. He has served the offices of Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Rome and Minister Counselor, serving from 1994 to 1996 as U.S. envoy and coordinator for the Bosnian Federation. Mediating between Croats and Muslims, Daniel assisted in negotiating the first agreement reached at the Dayton peace talks. Additionally, he has been part of the peace negotiations and peace-building efforts in Sudan, Iraq, and Afghanistan. At the United States Institute of Peace, he has held the positions of Vice President for Centers of Peace-Building Innovations, and Vice President for Peace and Stability Operations. His articles have appeared in The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, New York Times, and Washington Post. When asked, what does he do? He will reply, quote, "I make peace. I put it in cans and ship it abroad." Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Daniel Serwer.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the World Affairs Council. It's really an honor to present under its auspices. I'm told it has 98 around the country, and they play a key role in generating and sustaining the kind of citizen engagement in foreign policy I think is so important in today's increasingly interconnected world. As I'm going to say some harsh things about the State Department and USAID and even suggest they be abolished in favor of a single foreign office, I'd like to emphasize from the first that I have enormous respect for the Foreign Service and the devotion of its officers to pursuing America's interests abroad. I feel the same way about the U.S. military. But I don't think the Foreign Service is well served by the institutions that hire, pay, and deploy our diplomats and aid workers. And I don't think our military should be called upon to make up for civilian deficiencies. My book, Writing the Balance, is aimed at correcting those imbalances. But it doesn't start there. It starts with the broad sweep of American history, which has given our military a leading role in America's foreign affairs since at least, and here I was surprised to discover this when I started my work, since at least the French and Indian Wars. That is from before the founding of the Republic. Americans think of their country as a peaceful one, but in fact we've had troops deployed in conflict zones for more than a quarter of our history, and that does not even count the wars against Native Americans and pirates, which were very common for a good part of our history. And we've had troops deployed in conflict zones each and every year since the fall of the Berlin Wall. We are seeing a completely different world from the world the rest of the world is seeing. The rest of the world is seeing a sharp decline in interstate conflict while we've been engaged more than perhaps ever before in interstate conflict. With each of these wars, we improved our technology, expanded our reach, becoming by the end of the 20th century the world's only remaining superpower. We have a strong, well-exercised military arm for projecting power. It's so strong that it's reaching the point of diminishing returns. Every additional dollar buys less and less improvement in military capability. But our civilian capacities are much more limited. This was glaringly apparent in Iraq and Afghanistan, where state and AID struggled and all too often failed to meet the requirements. You only need read the article in this morning's paper about AID's inability to fully supervise a contractor, which has been documented also in many other cases, to realize how difficult it is and how lacking our capabilities are. It's also been glaringly apparent that we don't have the right capabilities in the reaction to the Arab uprisings, which not only caught our diplomats by surprise, that's not anything extraordinary, they caught everybody by surprise, but also left them puzzled as to what to do. These failures are more important than ever before. As Stephanie was suggesting, the enemies who cause us problems today are not often states. Saddam Hussein's Iraq fell quickly, as did the Taliban government in Afghanistan. We won those wars. We lost the peace. The main threats to America today come not from other strong states, but from non-state actors who find haven and support in fragile, weak, and collapsing states. Even in Ukraine, the Russians are not using the full weight of their armed forces. Rather, they're relying on disruption in challenging the legitimacy of Kiev's government and its control over territory in the east and south. It's quite a different pattern from the one we anticipated during the Cold War would happen, in which there would be a major clash between NATO and Russia. This is really a new technique, and it's a technique that plays to our weakness because we're strong in a military-on-military clash. We're not strong on a disruption on civilian institutions clash. National security, always more than a military mission, now requires conflict prevention and state-building capacities that are sorely lacking in both state and USAID. They have scrambled hard to meet the needs in Bosnia, Kosovo, South Sudan, Iraq, and Afghanistan, but they are not much better configured as institutions than when I arrived in Sarajevo for the first time in November of 1994. And I've got to tell you, that at that point they knew nothing about the state building process and what it would require. Now, some of you should be thinking, that's okay, because we never want to do this state building stuff ever again. It's not only my Johns Hopkins colleague Michael Mandelbaum who thinks that way. Each and every president since 1989 has resisted getting involved in other countries' internal politics, and each one has discovered that it's far easier to go to war and kill enemies than it is to withdraw, leaving behind a collapsed state that will regenerate those enemies. George H.W. Bush went into Somalia. He said he was only going to feed people. Passed off the state-building enterprise to an American-led UN mission, which failed there, and we're still at war in Somalia because of that failure. Bill Clinton said he was deploying American troops to Bosnia for just 1 year. Then we'd hold elections and get out. Why didn't we do that? Not because Bill Clinton was a softie, but because there was no way to get out without reigniting the war. George W. Bush had mocked the idea of a nation-building corps for America. And then several years later, after being elected, he created that corps. It's called the Civilian Response Corps. It's now being dismantled once again, but George W. Bush did create the Civilian Response Corps. And he also ordered the Defense Department to make stability operations, which is the Pentagon euphemism for state building, stability operations, a major task for the U.S. military, now demoted by Barack Obama to a responsibility of the reserves and not of the active duty military. The pattern is very clear. Each and every president wants to avoid these responsibilities. When he tries to avoid them, he doesn't have the capabilities he needs. So when he needs them, he finds them lacking, and the next president says, well, I mean, that didn't work last time, so let's not build up those capabilities this time. And the pattern is a repeated one, which guarantees that we will never be ready. But unless you are willing to fight on forever, even longer than the long war that the Pentagon talks about, you need to build capable states that protect their citizens reasonably well. We're discovering this today in Yemen, where the drone war, we are at war in Yemen and have been for some time, where the drone war appears to have created more terrorists than it's killed. This is one of the shying away from the state building responsibility is one of the main reasons President Obama has avoided military intervention in Syria. But the post-war effort there will still be a major one, even if it's not primarily a U.S. responsibility. In most cases, we try to pass off at least the easier cases to the UN or to a regional organization. If it's the UN, we end up paying a quarter anyway. In Syria, frankly, I think Syria is too serious an operation to pass off to the UN. It's very unclear to me how Syria will be put back together again when all of this is over. Maybe it won't be put back together, but that raises a whole another set of issues. You know, peace is threatening to break out in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in Colombia, and there are state-building enterprises there. We pay for a good deal of that state-building in both DRC and in Congo, and there are Americans involved. America would love to avoid the responsibility, but let's face it, if North Korea collapses, we'll be involved. If Cuba collapses, we'll be involved. I was in Cuba over spring break, just taking a little vacation. No, not really. I was, as I said to the to the immigration official, when I came back into the United States, I was studying the prospects for peaceful democratic transition in Cuba. And he grinned from ear to ear and said, "That's a great idea." Of course, he was a Cuban American, so he would think that was a great idea. But the fact of the matter is that it may not be peaceful, it may not be smooth, it may not be an easy transition in Cuba, and there's no way we can avoid it. What if things fly apart in nuclear-armed Pakistan? What if, God forbid, Iran comes apart? These are major, major problems for us, and we have very few civilian capabilities with which to confront them. If Ukraine is to be kept whole and independent, it will need a far better state than the one that has performed so badly since the Orange Revolution of 2005. This is a point Stephen Sestanovich, who knows much more about Ukraine than I do, made recently in an op-ed piece, that Ukraine is an example, if not of state failure, of state inefficiency, of state incapacity that is going to cost us a great deal. So in my view, we need to prepare for the day, not continue to delude ourselves that we will never take on these projects ever again, which frankly is a delusion that my favorite president, at least for the moment, Barack Obama, is also indulging in. But I'd be the first to admit that post-war state building, a subject I teach at SAIS, is hard and very expensive. Anticipation is much cheaper and better. We need foreign policy instruments, civilian ones, that will take early action to prevent states from collapsing and help initiate reforms. Now, you may ask me, well, where has that ever happened? And the answer is that we've been reasonably successful at allowing this to happen in much of Latin America and East Asia, where recent decades have seen many countries turn in the direction of democratic transition. If I just mention Brazil, Chile, South Korea, Indonesia, they're sterling examples of transitions that the United States at the very least allowed, in some cases nurtured, in some cases even encouraged. That's what we failed to do effectively in the Arab world, with consequences that are now on the front pages every day. We failed to anticipate the revolution in Tunisia. In Libya, we failed to help the new regime establish a monopoly on the legitimate means of violence, which is the professor's definition of sovereignty. That failure cost us an ambassador and 3 of his colleagues and has left Libya adrift. In Egypt, we've been inconstant, supporting whoever gains power. The result, as I observed during the constitutional referendum in January, I was there with a group that was observing the voting, is a restoration of the military autocracy, with voters intimidated into staying home rather than voting against the new constitution, and human rights activists imprisoned, along with the Muslim Brotherhood leadership and many Muslim Brotherhood activists condemned to death now in ridiculous one-day trials. The Amr Moussa was here today. He's an advisor to soon-to-be President Sisi, a long-standing stalwart of the dictatorship in Egypt, who is quick to say, we're going to do everything according to the Constitution. Well, but it's a Constitution that was written with very narrow political participation and clearly written to make the Muslim Brotherhood an illegal entity, because you're not allowed to form a political party on a religious basis. The foreign minister of Egypt was here, Nabil Fahmy, who was ambassador in Washington for a long time. He was pleased to claim that the reason why 800 and some odd people were being condemned to death in a single-day trial was that there was independence of the judiciary. Well, anybody who believes that is living in a different world from mine. What we're seeing in Egypt is restoration of the military autocracy. I frankly wouldn't have believed it was possible even 6 months ago, but it looks like it is. In Syria, we failed to support moderates, only to see them displaced and now replaced by extremists. The result is a daily catastrophe of truly genocidal dimensions. I met with a young Syrian today who described to me the attacks on his town right outside Damascus, which is suffering terribly from surrounded by regime forces, and it's truly horrendous what's going on. They are trying to starve out the opposition. They're shelling civilian areas, and we didn't act when we could have. I'm not sure there's a lot we could do now. The specific areas I describe as lacking in today's state in AID, because I do try to be very specific in the book, are these: mobilizing early preventive action, reforming security services. We train a lot of soldiers and police abroad, but we do very little to train the people who have to exercise oversight over their behavior. Promoting democracy. We have a bureaucracy that promotes democracy abroad. Some of it is very, very high quality, but it's confused. It's too close to the U.S. government. It's not independent enough, and it's not well enough funded. Countering violent extremism. Just a few years ago, there was a hearing in Congress, and the guy in charge of counterterrorism efforts in the State Department was asked, well, how much money are you investing in countering violent extremism? And he said, well, there are 10 ambassadors abroad, each of whom has $150,000. That was the extent of our countering violent extremism efforts in the State Department 10 years after 9/11. Now, things have improved in the last couple of years, and there are a number of international initiatives that we're participating in, but there was really very, very little until recently. The fifth area I identify as very weak in the current state in AID is encouraging citizen and cultural diplomacy. These efforts that I've named are all at the periphery of traditional diplomacy, because traditional diplomacy is what Stephanie said it was. It's ambassadors carrying messages back and forth. And I readily admit that the first two, mobilizing early action, reforming security services, are more appropriately done mainly within the U.S. government. And the latter three, promoting democracy, countering violent extremism, and encouraging citizen and cultural diplomacy, are better done by the non-governmental world at arm's length from the U.S. government, but with congressional funding. We need a lot more of these things, but I don't think that we can get them done with our current institutions, which were designed for different purposes in other eras. Inertia and legacy are simply too strong. The State Department, originally the Department of the State, that's why it's called the State Department. There is no other foreign office on earth called the State Department, except I discovered one. I discovered that in pre-Castro Cuba, their foreign office was known as the State Department, because they were copying us, obviously. The State Department, which had domestic as well as international functions when it was first created, the first Congress actually created a foreign office, but decided it wouldn't have enough work to do. And so they threw the Foreign Office in with the Department of the State, which did some domestic things and then took on international responsibilities. That's why the Great Seal of the United States, which was used to seal all official documents, not only international ones, is in a glass case near the cafeteria in the State Department. If you ever make it in there, you should have a look. But now the State Department is basically a conventional 19th century style foreign office. Most Foreign Service personnel serve abroad in static embassies and other missions servicing agents of the U.S. government other than the State Department. This is important to recognize. I was DCM in Rome, and what I can tell you is that there was a very high percentage of non-State Department agencies present in Rome. There were actually 36 of them. Legacy and inertia, not current needs, dictate where the State Department stations people, and a good deal of what they're doing as well. Why are there 800 people in the U.S. mission in Italy? Well, there were 800 there when I got there for the first time, my first tour there in '77. There were 800 when I left in '81. There were 800 when I came back in '87. There were only 720 when I left in '93 because the ambassador and I was deputy chief of mission. We cut way back on, we thought we were cutting way back on the personnel by cutting 10%. I think now that we could have cut 50% without too much difficulty. And it's, of course, back up to 800 now because nobody is paid to be an ambassador and shrink his embassy. They're only paid to increase the size of their embassies. USAID was founded with a poverty alleviation and economic development mission to help fight the Cold War. Few of us still think that U.S. government programs can fix poverty at home, and I have grave doubts about whether we can do it overseas as well. There have been a lot of proposals for reform, and I won't review those, but just mention that we should remember Condoleezza Rice's program for transformational diplomacy, and that was followed by Hillary Clinton's quadrennial diplomacy and development review, which is now being reprised by the State Department. They're redoing it. So far as I can tell, they're redoing it entirely in-house, so it will be as unsuccessful as the first one was. The first one recommended that the State Department refocus its attention on a whole panoply of problems, including conflict prevention, including state building, including the things that I've mentioned, but also other things like climate change, like pandemics and other things. And then it redeployed essentially no resources to pursue those objectives. It was a very good analytical document. It was a total failure as a bureaucratic reform exercise. What I think we need to do now, I have a lot of respect for Tom Pickering and others of my former colleagues who have written report after report after report with recommendations for how the State Department should be reformed, state and USAID. And none of that has led to profound changes, and certainly none of the requirements that I'm talking about here are even met to a small degree. What I think we need to do is to conduct what scientists call a thought experiment. A thought experiment is when you ask yourself a tough question, but one that you can answer by thinking hard about it. And the thought experiment is just this: knowing what we do about the challenges we now face and the means that are available in this 21st century world to meet them. What kind of foreign policy instruments do we really need? I don't know anybody who would answer that question by saying we need what we've got. In fact, I think most people would reasonably answer we need something that's nothing like what we've got. What that suggests to me is that we need to think from scratch, from the ground up. My book does not offer a detailed design, but it does suggest that we need a single foreign office with a national security focus. That is not the current main focus of the State Department, as well as a much enhanced non-governmental effort, operated at arm's length from officialdom, but with much greater congressional funding than it has today. I'm talking about the institutions like the National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute, National Endowment for Democracy, the ABA Rule of Law program. These are vital elements of our foreign policy today. They are underfunded, and they are much too much under the thumb of the State Department and USAID. Now, at this point, people would be reasonable to ask, well, how are you going to fund all of this? You know, you want more money. And at this point, most people who take up the cudgels for foreign policy say, well, we can fund all of this with an F-22 or maybe 2 F-22s. Just forget about building them. But I'm only too well aware that that won't work. It never has worked. U.S. government doesn't deal in green dollar bills. It deals in dollar bills that are different colors for different agencies. And you can't switch them from one agency to another because the subcommittees, the appropriation subcommittees in Congress that distribute the money won't let you. They sometimes allow small amounts of money to flow between defense and state, mostly from defense to state, though there are large quantities of money that also flow from state to defense. I don't believe that anybody's going to cancel 2 F-22s to do what I'm suggesting. I think state and AID have the resources to do what's needed, but unfortunately tied up in those elephantine embassies supporting other U.S. government agencies. Shrinking those dramatically would provide the funds for a much sleeker and more effective foreign office, including a corps of several thousand people able and willing to deploy with or without U.S. troops to difficult environments to take on the hard work of conflict prevention and state building where required. Just to offer an example, there is now a civilian stabilization operations office in the State Department, and it had people deployed in South Sudan for a year after independence, and it was doing exactly the right things, working on intra-ethnic conflict issues in the South. Everybody knew that there were these tribal issues that could explode in the South. And after a year of deployment, they said, well, we haven't got any more money for this. We've got other priorities. They withdrew them. And a year after that, civil war has exploded in South Sudan. Well, I'm not saying that civil war would necessarily have been avoided. What I'm saying is we shouldn't have to withdraw from a situation like that for lack of resources. What we need is a far more agile, anticipatory, and mobile foreign service, one built for a world in which virtually everyone will soon be connected to worldwide communications at reasonable cost. I want to repeat that. Virtually every human being on Earth during maybe my lifetime will be, in theory, connected to every other human being on Earth at reasonable cost. That is an amazing development, and one which should cast grave doubt on the 19th century architecture of the State Department, with the big headquarters on C Street and these elephantine embassies in very fixed places on Earth with 800 people continuing to be in Rome no matter what happens in the world. And I want to underline also that what this does, what this interconnectedness does, is to make ordinary citizens, people like you and me, have much greater potential, peace-building potential than ever before, because I can go to Cuba, because I can invest money, as I do with a charity called Kiva, in small development projects in Zambia. I can get data from Aleppo, which is under siege, and some colleagues at a company called Kairos Associates have actually enlisted the help of Syrian NGOs in reporting very fine-grained reports about who controls which territory inside the city of Aleppo, which is actually the largest city in Syria. And all of this is mapped and displayed on the internet. It's an extraordinary capability, and it costs very, very little money. So we're just at the beginning of using all of these communications capabilities to be able to do a kind of citizen diplomacy that we haven't been able to do in the past. I was out in Alexandria last night. I gave a quick talk to a sister cities organization in Alexandria, and they have sister city relationships with, I think 5 different cities around the world, in Ukraine, in Mexico, in El Salvador, in France, and in Germany. And what they can do today with those relationships is infinitely greater than what they could have done 20 years ago. And they're building on those relationships all the time, not only for cultural purposes, not only for educational purposes, which are the traditional roles of sister city relationships, but for commercial purposes, for even diplomatic purposes in the broadest sense of the term. And it really is exciting to see what they're able to do, because worldwide communications are now essentially cost nothing. I tweet every day. I communicate with over 4,000 people without it's costing me a dime. I mean, this is extraordinary. And I encourage you also to take on those challenges of citizen diplomacy, to visit places that you might not visit otherwise, communicate with places that you might not communicate with otherwise, and to enjoy the real benefits of this communications technology, because it makes citizens like you much more important to America's relations abroad and to the protection of our national security than you have ever been before in your lives. It used to be, when I was 18, the way you contributed to American national security was to get drafted. And today you can contribute by projecting an image of America abroad that is one that you decide, not the State Department, not AID, but that you decide. And I think that's an extraordinarily challenging but also very beautiful world, and I encourage you to indulge in it. And I think I'll take questions now.
You had mentioned, you were talking about non-state actors, and I have a problem with non-state actors and violent extremists, because what the violent extremists will claim a particular ideology, but there are a lot of intelligence agencies in the world that can go undercover as, for example, an Islamist. You don't have to be Islamic to be a so-called Islamic extremist. And Roseborn Export is a Russian or communist country manufactured weapons that the so-called Islamic extremists use routinely. And countries like Japan can conduct treachery very surreptitiously against us, and they get no blame whatsoever. So I'm wondering, do you think that the so-called violent extremists and non-state actors are really non-state, and are they really extreme about what they claim to be extreme about?
Well, when I talk about non-state actors, I don't necessarily mean that they are not backed by a state, but they're not wearing the uniform of a state. The question of whether terrorists are backed by states is one that I always associate with Claire Sterling. Probably nobody else in the room remembers Claire Sterling raised this issue, I think it must be 35 years ago. And what she asserted was that these are not non-state actors. They're backed by Iran, they're backed by Saudi Arabia, they're backed by this one, they're backed by that one. Well, I have no doubt that there are states that back non-state actors who are doing something that they want done. That's exactly what we do, as a matter of fact, when we back democracy activists in autocratic countries. But there's a big difference between that, in my opinion, and backing people who are blowing up civilians at random. The fact is, it is extremely difficult to trace the resources that go to non-state actors, and there are big parts of the U.S. government now, you can read about them in Dana Priest's book, devoted to exactly that subject. I don't believe the Japanese are doing much in this particular terrain against the United States, but I do think that there is state backing for non-state actors who attack us. For example, it was very clear in Iraq that we were being attacked in part by non-state actors in the employ of Iran. It's quite clear that there are Saudis, maybe not always official Saudis, who are supporting the extremists in Syria. Do I believe that the extremists are serious? Well, it varies, but on the whole, I believe people who will either blow themselves up or get other people to blow themselves up are pretty damn serious and need to be paid some attention to. Islamic extremism is ideologically based, and part of the problem with ignoring Syria, in my view, and the mistake Barack Obama is making, is not to recognize that ignoring Syria will feed Islamic extremism, will give Islamic extremism a haven. And that's going to eventually threaten the United States. So, yes, I take them seriously. Their declared goal in many cases is the formation of an Islamic caliphate. And where is the caliphate if not in Syria and in Iraq? So I think we have underreacted in Syria in particular. But, you know, there's no infinite wisdom on these issues, and a president has to do triage on the problems that he faces, and he's chosen to worry much more about Iranian nuclear weapons than about extremists in Syria, and that, to me, is what we pay him the big bucks for. So, yes, I think there is state backing. It's hard to track, but there are extremists who believe in what they're doing, and they've shown with their actions that they really believe it.
My question is regarding the role of the private sector. And I know in your book you mentioned that there's going to be missions that will need government funding, but they're better done through the private sector. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and also maybe discuss the role of contractors and if there's reforms needed there. Thank you.
This is a complicated question, more complicated than it sounds like, because there are many different kinds of private sector organizations. There are the private voluntary organizations like World Vision and Catholic Relief Services, International Rescue Committee. They're both secular and religious organizations of that type. And they are contractors to the U.S. government, as the formal term may be grantee in some cases, but they are contractors or grantees. They get a lot of money from the U.S. government, but they also raise money through private donations, because they are, if you give to them, you get a tax deduction. But there are other private organizations that are contractors to the U.S. government, like I was at Chemonics today, which is an employee-owned firm, but a profit-making one, I believe. And they sell their services to the U.S. government to do work that in many respects may be quite similar to the work done by the private voluntary organizations. So you have a kind of competition between real private sector organizations and charitable organizations going on within the AID contracting world. Then you have other organizations that are contracted not to actually provide relief the way Mercy Corps or World Vision or IRC does, but to support either the U.S. military or the organizations that are providing relief and development assistance. So that when I was at U.S. Institute of Peace and we were going into Iraq during the war, we had to have contractors who provided our security services. We had to have various people to feed, house us while we were in Iraq. Most people serving abroad in an operation like Iraq and Afghanistan, apart from the U.S. military, are contractors of one sort or another. So I don't take up the cudgels against contractors by no means, but I do think that there are some things that are inherently governmental functions that need U.S. government officials tending them. Mobilizing early action is one, because it's basically a question of mobilizing the U.S. government. The second I mentioned is reforming security services. And by reform of that is not private guards, but reforming police and militaries abroad. So when we send uniformed military to go train the ministries of defense and interior in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're doing precisely the wrong thing. That should be civilian government employees who should be doing that work. So you have to slice the private sector rather finely, because there really are a large variety of organizations and functions that lie in the private sector.
Please forgive the comparison, but when I was listening to you discuss about how U.S. embassies and foreign service should be more nimble, mobile to move around in a country, I couldn't help but recall Rumsfeld's comparisons of how the U.S. military should be redesigned to be quicker, more nimble, agile. What would be your ideal of a U.S. embassy staffing in another country?
Well, I think I say in the book no more than 50 Americans in a normal U.S. embassy. There'd be some like Moscow where you might have to have more. Baghdad, you'd have more. But I think 50 should be a standard size American embassy. That's smaller, I think, than even the so-called small embassy program. I remember, I'll tell you this anecdote to give you an idea of the kinds of problems my ideas face. I was DCM in Rome when Albania overthrew communism. And 10,000 Albanians started arriving on a single ship in Italy. It was quite a scene. Our embassy in Tirana had been leased out, sort of. There was an agreement. There was no payment, but there was an agreement, to the Italians for more than 45 years. And I was instructed to go tell the Italians that we're going to reestablish diplomatic relations with Tirana, and we want our embassy back. And I knew that they would resist this, and I knew they would tell me that the place was a mess. We didn't really want it back. So, but I happened to have, they'd given me actually a great big thick picture book of Italian embassies abroad. And if you know anything about the Italians, you know that bella figura is important. And the picture book of Italian embassies abroad was really quite spectacular. And it included Tirana, which was a beautiful, charming, fairly small building. So I went in to say, we want our embassy back. Thank you very much for maintaining it all these years. And they said, oh, you don't want that thing back. It's a mess. Whipped out the book, threw it on the desk, and said, it doesn't look like a mess to me. Then they said something that I really regret I didn't make us listen to more carefully. They said, look, it's a very small building. You'll never be able to fit an American embassy in that thing. And I said, well, you know, they've instructed me that this is to be a small embassy. We're going to do all its administrative support out of Rome. It'll never have more than, and I don't remember the number, but it'll never have more than 20 or 25 people, something like that. You know that within a year and a half, it had almost 100 people. We had had to completely take apart the old building to build a great big new building on the back of it. I saw it years later. It was sad. It was sad, and I suspect we have 150 people in Tirana today, Americans. I'd be very surprised if it's much smaller than that, and that's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. There are countries that punch above their weight in diplomacy. If you want a few examples, it's Norway, it's the Netherlands, it's Sweden. They punch above their weight. We're punching below our weight.
You're mentioning the civilian aspect and the military aspect, and I wanted you to comment on what seems to be a major player, U.S. government employees, and I'm talking about the CIA and other intelligence agencies, some of whom, of course, had operational units that the State Department doesn't control and that the military doesn't control. And I'd like you to comment on how that aspect, I mean, I don't know that you can reveal this, but of these 800 people in Rome, how many of these third type of folks are there?
This is a very important subject that I decided not to deal with in the book because it would have doubled the size of the damn thing and I couldn't afford to spend another 2 years at it. If you want to read about it, the book to read is Dana Priest's. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary because it talks not only about the world I knew before I left the State Department in '98, but it talks about the growth since 9/11, which is simply unbelievable. And the growth is not just in numbers. The growth is in functions as well. And since I do not maintain security clearances and know the following information only from the press, I feel free to state it and state it boldly. CIA now has armies. Those armies consist very often of a lot of foreign nationals, but they are armies. There was an article the other day about their disbanding some special forces that they had trained in Afghanistan. Non-Americans in countries where we intervene are acutely aware of the presence of a large number of civilian and military people who do not behave as if they are part of the U.S. government. In fact, I've been asked several times, how many U.S. governments are there? And when I answer that question with a question, what the hell do you mean? The answer is, well, you've got the U.S. Army, and then you've got these other guys in uniform with guns. So how many U.S. governments are there? For quite some time, the charitable organizations that do relief work were complaining about people not in uniform, armed, distributing humanitarian assistance. And they were exploding at our military people that they were doing this. It wasn't our military people doing this. It wasn't the U.S. Army doing this. U.S. Army wears uniforms and doesn't generally, though it does sometimes distribute humanitarian assistance, and it does that because it's required by law to do that and by international law in cases where we've occupied a country. But the guys without uniforms, carrying guns, distributing humanitarian assistance are not U.S. Army. They're the other guys. This is a big, big problem. It was a big problem for a DCM, for an ambassador in the early 90s when when the requirements were still quite conventional. But when you intervene in foreign countries, whether it's a wartime intervention or even an intervention like the one for the Pakistani floods, earthquakes, it becomes colossally difficult and complicated. And I do not believe that the U.S. government controls all of its own assets with the care that it should, and I think it's quite clear to non-Americans that these separate forces exist. It's a subject that should be discussed more in the United States, and we should make some reasonable decisions about how much of this we want and how much we're willing to tolerate. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.